In a week where the budget has dominated the news, it's on the issue of justice where this Labour government may prove most radical. That's because on Tuesday, the government announced they would be scrapping jury trials for all but the most serious cases in England and Wales. And the changes are being billed by ministers as a solution to tackling the enormous backlog of court cases, with more than 78,000 cases currently waiting to be heard, some of them for many years. So some trial dates now are 4 years in advance. So that is a genuinely real problem. We can't ignore that. These proposals, though, do seem to go against 800 years of precedent. Right? The idea that you are tried by your peers goes quite far back in British history. The briefing from the government, which they are understood to be officially announcing next week, follows on from recommendations given by former Judge Brian Levson. So it doesn't come out of nowhere. In July this year, Sir Brian Levson suggested the introduction of intermediate courts. They would have a judge and 2 magistrates or lay people, and they would only oversee cases where prison of up to 3 years was a potential punishment. Labour, though, are now suggesting that only 1 judge would be needed to decide on the guilt of a defendant, and it would be for defendants facing up to 5 years in prison. So let's see. I mean, 3 years is serious. 5 years is much more serious. And the only exception seems to be pretty much murder, manslaughter, or rape. So anything else you're tried for, it could be just you and the judge. I mean, presumably other people are in the room, but it's the judge who decides your fate. The plans have provoked widespread protest. Richard Atkinson is a former president of the Law Society.
I think it's an incredibly poor reaction to what I accept is a very serious problem, to change a fundamental principle of English justice, that lay people have an important part to play in the application of the criminal law and the determination of whether someone is guilty or not, which could have serious consequences for either the defendant or the principal complainant, is a departure that I don't believe is justified by the present circumstances.
Former Judge Wendy Joseph KC also explained her concerns.
Crown Court judges, those who sit on jury trials, at the moment never make findings of fact in the sense of guilt or innocence. There may be very, very rare and esoteric situations where they have to, but by and large, it's always been the province of your listeners, of all of us, of the jury, to make that really important decision, guilty or not. So judges have no training in how to find facts. And there is one mind working if you've only got one judge sitting on the case. At the moment, we have a system where 12 people from 12 different lives with 12 different sets of experiences pool those experiences and work together to try and find the right, the true verdict. It will not be the same if one person does it, and a lot of judges will feel very uncomfortable about it.
The Criminal Bar Association has also released a pretty strong statement on the proposed changes. So they said, jury trial in place for hundreds of serious offences is a right which has been applauded and emulated by other nations. It is woven into the fabric of British society and is something of which the public has rightly been proud. Juries are trusted by ordinary working people, the very people this government repeatedly and pointedly professes to care for, to represent and to keep safe from harm. Juries are made up of ordinary human beings from all walks of life, of all ages, sex and ethnic background. Those are, I think, everyone will agree, very strong arguments. The government would argue in response, though, that if these are desperate measures, it's only because they find themselves in very desperate times. Sarah Sackman is the courts minister who spoke to The Guardian about why the government was considering reforms such as these. So she said, behind these 80,000 odd cases that are waiting in the backlog, there are individual stories and individual lives being put on hold behind each and every one of those cases. I've spoken to victims and survivors who tell me they've lost their jobs, they've suffered mental breakdowns all the while that they were waiting. More victims and witnesses are pulling out of the process because they cannot wait that long. That is compelling illustration of justice delayed being justice denied. Do we think that someone who has stolen a bottle of whiskey from a mini-mart should receive the right to trial by jury? Do we think that someone who has been involved in a serious fraud involving cryptocurrency, that we should have a jury sat in court for a year or more, hearing such a case. For me, the priority is swift justice, fair justice, over prioritising a defendant's right to choose where that trial is heard. By the time that trial comes to court, everyone's memories are a little bit more fuzzy. If you're years away from when it took place, can you really get justice at all? That's not fair. Claimants dropping out of trials before they go to court is a huge problem alongside the backlog itself. So The Guardian reported earlier this year the number of rape victims pulling out of prosecutions before trial has more than doubled in 5 years, reaching nearly 8% of cases last year. So you can imagine if you're in a case, you've been subject to a horrific crime, and then you have to wait 4 years for justice, and you have to have that hanging over your head for 4 years. Also, if you've been wrongly accused of something and you have to have that hanging over your head for 4 years, that is terrible. That is a really, really, really bad problem that does need a proper solution. But this is a very extreme response. And it does put the Justice Secretary in particular in a difficult position. So in his 2017 review into racial bias in the criminal justice system, David Lammy praised juries, saying this. Juries deliberate as a group through open discussion. This both deters and exposes prejudice or unintended bias. Judgments must be justified to others. Successive studies have shown that juries deliver equitable results, regardless of the ethnic makeup of the jury or the defendant in question. Lammy also said something about juries in 2020, and this was after juryless trials were first discussed. So he said this, jury trials are a fundamental part of our democratic settlement. Criminal trials without juries are a bad idea. The government need to pull their finger out and acquire empty public buildings across the country to make sure these can happen in a way that is safe. Obviously 2020, we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic, which is, one of the reasons why the courts are on their knees is because of austerity. Another one, a very big one actually, is that they couldn't really operate during COVID-19, which meant that you built up this enormous backlog. It always gets harder to clear a backlog when it's got very large. Apparently this is because also less people are pleading guilty because they see, if I've got to wait 4 years, maybe I might get off. So that's one of the reasons why the backlog is creating a bigger backlog, if you see what I mean. Kemi Badenoch was quick to jump on the apparent change of heart from the Justice Secretary. So she said this, juries are not just part of our tradition, they put ordinary men and women of every walk of life at the heart of justice. Labour wants to shred this basic right, replacing the common sense of the jury box with rule by lawyers. It is a short-term decision that risks fairness, undermines public trust, and erodes the very foundation of our justice system. David Lammy used to agree, so what's changed? She says Conservatives believe in our traditions and we believe in trial by jury. Sian Berry also put out a statement from the Green Party, so she said this. This is yet another assault on our rights from an increasingly authoritarian government. This proposal would scrap a fundamental cornerstone of our justice system, which has been in place for 800 years. For David Lammy to describe the right to trial by jury as not a right is a disgrace. The government must fund our justice system properly, not make people pay for Labour and Conservative austerity with their fundamental rights. The Green Party will fight these proposals all the way. I have seen some people sort of online comment this is akin to fascism. It's actually akin to France. So France has this system. So if this comes into place, it's not like, democracy is over. But I still do think this is very bad, as we're actually going to see when we talk about our next story, which is how the judges have been switched in the case against Palestine Action. So obviously, if you have judges who all have different opinions, by the way, and then you can have them sort of shifted around based on the case, I'm not sure I wouldn't want one individual to decide whether I was going to prison for 5 years or to decide whether someone who had committed a crime against me was guilty. James, this is big, isn't it? This strikes me as a really big deal.
It is a really big deal. It seems to be a big deal done for not brilliant reasons. So the stuff about there are 800 years of precedent here, it kind of matters. I don't want to get too starry-eyed about our noble traditions of common law and various rights that we enjoy in this country, but they do actually matter. One of your barriers to not being able to have an authoritarian government do whatever it wants in this country are things like the right to trial by jury. It matters that you have this element of uncertainty and popular participation that's introduced into the system. Entirely sort of judge-led system is not something we have here. And yeah, they do have it in France. This is the continental system where you have an interrogative judge. One of the people you clipped was talking about this. But we don't have a system here set up to make that work and make that work in a way that would be fair and considered and reasonable reasonable. And P.S., we haven't had a revolution that would establish that sort of system, rather than the government sort of scrabbling around and saying, oh dear, there's a bit of a sort of backlog problem. Let's just trash 800 years worth of acquired rights and try and get through it that way. The austerity thing is a major part of this. Like, of the departments that have been cut under austerity since 2010, Justice Department is one of the ones that has been absolutely hammered. It's been hammered by successive Conservative-led governments in particular, because it looks like a bit of a free hit. I mean, if you just winkle away at like legal aid, if you whittle away at the fact that you're not going to have enough judges being trained and can't run enough courts and all the rest of it, it looks like a bit of a free hit for a while, until eventually it turns into a massive backlog. And as you correctly say, COVID simply added to this. This is a solid case for saying you need to put some money into something to make this work. You don't try and do what seems to be a cheap solution with these awful consequences, and they are awful consequences if you were to introduce this on something of a whim or as a sort of desperate sort of measure because you can't put the money there, rather than saying, okay, this is a serious considered proper proposal to try and reform the system, which even then, by the way, I'd probably oppose. I mean, it strikes me that the right to trial by jury is so fundamental to the kind of rights that we enjoy in this country and other places that have similar sort of common law derived systems, that you can't just get rid of that, and you need to defend it. And it's good to see so many people running around to say this is an absolutely stupid, awful idea from the government.
It just does seem like a really strange example of a short-term problem, and a serious, as we keep saying, it's a really serious short-term problem. Like, real harms are being done here, and I think probably there isn't a particular simple solution. I think that I think the government face a real challenge here. I wouldn't want to be in that position. It seems hard. I haven't sort of seen anyone saying it's really easy to fix this. Like, it sounds like it's difficult to fix this, but this is a short-term acute problem, and they seem to be making or proposing a change which has sort of centuries-long significance. And I find it weird that it's on this issue, because there are issues where there are secular crises, like an aging population does potentially mean that some sort of types of policy we've been used to won't work anymore. And, about how we fund pensions, how we fund the NHS. There's all sorts of these things where sort of like there is a trajectory of society which does mean we need to radically rethink things. There's an argument that sort of the fact that so many people can move these days in smartphones means that a similar thing applies to migration. I think that there are sort of secular changes in society that mean that radical policies might be warranted. But there are more people committing crimes. If anything, there's less people committing crimes. And pensioners are perfectly capable of serving on juries. So this just doesn't seem like we have a long-term policy that needs a radical fix. It seems like a long-term problem, that needs a radical fix. It seems like we've got this very short-term acute problem that should probably have a short-term acute fix, not something which completely changes the relationship between the citizen and the state. I find it completely bizarre. Let's go on to our next story, which, if you had any doubts about problems with judge-led justice, might push you into finding this as worrying as we do.